Edwin loved apple jam buns, but recently there wasn't enough food, let alone buns. For the third consecutive year, their village had been suffering from a drought, dooming its inhabitants to hunger and despair. Edwin's father, an ordinary farmer, could barely feed his family. All they had left was one cow, Blackie, but she was so emaciated that she gave very little milk, barely enough to sustain them. The village was surrounded by fields that were once green and fertile, but had now turned into dry, lifeless expanses. Dried stalks whispered in the wind, like shadows of former abundance. In the center of the village stood an ancient temple where the villagers prayed to the gods, offering various sacrifices in an attempt to appease them and end the drought. But the gods seemed indifferent. People said that dark forces had cursed them. Edwin's friend, Big Earl, told him that if things continued like this, the villagers would leave. But moving to another place wasn't easy either, as many monsters had recently proliferated in the area, and knights who could hunt them down had not been seen for a long time. Edwin was already 10 years old and had long been helping his parents with the household chores, but he wasn't allowed to go into the forest to look for berries yet. However, this time the situation was different. They needed some food. He set out in the morning while it was still cool. The village was already bustling, people hurrying about their business, paying no attention to the boy. Leaving the village, he headed north, crossing fields and farms. Soon he saw the forest in the distance. To be honest, he was afraid to go there, but he had spent all of the previous day convincing himself that everything would be fine. Holding a basket in his hands, he took a deep breath and stepped into the forest. Here, it was greener than the surrounding area. The tree canopies provided some respite from the scorching heat. Edwin walked slowly, constantly looking around for danger. In this place, one had to be really careful. Around the trees grew dried grass, which he sometimes pushed aside with a long stick, looking for berry bushes or mushrooms, though he didn't expect to find mushrooms since it hadn't rained for a long time. He walked, memorizing landmarks to find his way back. Suddenly he saw small red dots ahead. Could it be what he thought? He quickened his pace, and when he reached the spot he saw berry bushes. These were edible berries that he used to love eating. Overjoyed by this find, he immediately began to collect them. There were indeed a lot of berries, which excited the boy. So engrossed in his task, he didn't notice something sneaking up on him. But when the creature was just a few steps away, it accidentally stepped on a dry twig, causing a crunch that the boy heard. He immediately looked up, and in horror saw a terrifying monster standing not far from him. It looked like a spider but had sinister, slimy skin. Its body was covered with a black carapace. Instead of 8 eyes, it had one large one with a rhomboid pupil. Its huge jaws dripped green saliva. The creature crept slowly, but when it saw that it had been detected, it suddenly jumped. Edwin managed to dodge and rolled, then ran. Fear washed over him like cold water, but he overcame the weakness, and adrenaline gradually filled his body. He didn't look back and kept running, feeling the pursuit behind him. After running less than 20 feet, he felt a push in his back, which sent him flying forward and tumbling, landing on his back. The wind was knocked out of him, leaving him breathless. The beast stood over him, its green saliva falling onto his face and sliding down. Edwin thought it was the end and closed his eyes in resignation. But suddenly he heard the creature scream in rage. Opening his eyes, he saw not the monster, but a huge figure clad in black armor that seemed to absorb the light. A knight, Edwin thought to himself, feeling relieved. In the knight's hands was a huge black sword, which he skillfully wielded, deflecting the monster's attacks. Edwin remembered the creature's name, Zangrax. His father had once mentioned them, but he said they had long been extinct. So where did this one come from? Meanwhile, the battle continued. The Black Knight moving with grace and strength that couldn't go unnoticed. Every movement was precise, like a master swordsman. He knew the enemy was dangerous, but his confidence and experience left no room for doubt. Zangrax tried to attack him with its sharp jaws, but the knight deftly dodged, delivering precise blows with his sword. Metal met flesh and carapace, echoing through the forest silence. The monster lunged forward, but the knight parried the attack, stepping back and with incredible speed delivered a counterstrike, leaving a deep gash in the monster's black carapace. The creature howled in pain, its poisonous green blood splattering the ground. The knight didn't give it time to recover. He moved like a shadow, not giving Zangrax a chance to counterattack. Another blow and another, each precise, each powerful. Soon, the monster began to falter. Its movements became slow and clumsy. It tried to flee, but the knight didn't allow it. The final swing of the sword, and the monster was cut in half. The knight stood over the defeated foe, his armor stained with green blood. He slowly turned to Edwin, his eyes hidden behind the helmet, seeming to drill into the boy. "Are you all right?" he asked in a low, growling voice. Edwin, still trembling from the recent terror, could only nod. He felt his breath returning, but he couldn't take his eyes off the knight. "Who are you?" he finally asked. "I'm just a knight," the stranger replied. Edwin's eyes widened further as he looked at this giant with a mix of awe and fear, realizing that he had indeed been lucky today. Richard looked at the boy with mixed feelings. One more second, and this creature would have devoured him. Earlier, he was walking along the road, but decided to turn into the forest and hunt. He hadn't had a proper meal for a long time and thought he might get lucky this time. But to his surprise, when he entered the forest, it was almost empty. Of course, if you talk about edible creatures, there was plenty of filth and monsters. When he had slaughtered dozens of them, he walked towards the road and saw this boy. Luck was clearly on his side. Richard approached the boy and lifted him, causing the boy to shiver and shrink. He could see him in more detail. He was wearing a worn linen shirt with holes, which had once been white but had now acquired a grayish tint from dust and dirt. The pants, once sturdy and new, hung on him in tatters, barely covering his knees, and his bare feet were covered in scratches and dust. "You're from the village, aren't you? Can you show the way?" asked the knight. The boy looked up and nodded, then timidly walked forward. As they passed by the bushes where the berries grew, the knight said, "Isn't that your basket? Take it too. You managed to gather some berries?" The boy nodded and picked up the basket, scooping up the scattered berries. Richard glanced into the basket and realized it was half empty. He then sat down on the ground. The boy looked at him in surprise, as he had just asked to be taken to the village. The knight pointed to the berries and said, "Fill the basket since you came here despite the dangers. I'll wait." The boy's eyes widened with delight. He was thrilled by this turn of events and immediately set to work. It took another half hour. During this time, Richard sat still, contemplating the past few days. It had been a week since he had left the cursed forest and headed south towards the city where a mage who could break his curse lived. During his journey, he realized both the advantages and disadvantages of his new form. The positives included increased endurance, strength, and agility. He could also go without sleep for a couple of days and still feel fine. But there were also drawbacks. He constantly had to wear his armor, and he couldn't eat in public because when he opened the visor on his helmet, his mouth with sharp teeth was visible. Eating was also difficult. He mostly just swallowed food, tearing it apart. Unfortunately, he hadn't learned to hunt. Having worked in a forge all his life, he didn't know the basics. He had supplies given to him by an old man and some money, which he spent on buying food from street vendors he met along the way. He realized he needed to learn how to hunt because animals usually ran away at the sight of him, unlike monsters, which attacked him instead. But they were inedible. Once he tried roasting one, but the meat tasted so awful that the aftertaste lingered for a few days. He concluded that he couldn't live without people for now, and needed to find a way to earn a living. Another drawback was his enormous height and size. He attracted too much attention. But since he never took off his helmet, no one had suspected anything yet. Finally, the boy finished, and bowing said they could go. Richard stood up, his armor creaking, and followed the boy with heavy steps. Leaving the forest, they moved through a meadow overgrown with dry grass. The grass crunched underfoot, sometimes getting caught in the gaps of the armor, while grasshoppers jumped ahead of them, clearing the way. Soon they reached a road, consisting of 2 rutted tracks from wagons, occasionally covered with manure from livestock driven along there. The smell of dried manure mixed with the scent of wormwood, which grew abundantly along the path. Occasionally gusts of wind lifted dust and dry stems. The boy pointed to the right, indicating the village was that way. The knight nodded, but soon turned his head, hearing the sound of hooves in the distance. They waited, and soon a small wooden cart pulled by a donkey came into view. A thin old man in an old gray robe sat on it, wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat. The old man's face was etched with deep wrinkles, and instead of eyes, he had terrible scars as if someone had burned them out. A small, neat beard gave him a wise look, but the sly smile that never left his face spoiled it. Around his neck hung an amulet in the shape of a crescent moon that glinted dully. Richard immediately recognized the sign of the goddess of the moon night, Lunael. This order was small and often despised among the more popular cults. The donkey, approaching the knight, sniffed and suddenly brayed fearfully, making an unpleasant sound. The monk struck it with a whip, and the animal calmed down. "Sorry, this foolish creature sometimes behaves wildly," said the monk, then introduced himself. "My name is Balthazar. I am a simple wandering monk and am now heading to the village. Are you heading there too, or coming from there?" he asked, raising the brim of his hat as if trying to see them with his blind eyes. "My name is Richard. I am a wandering knight. Yes, we are going to the village." "A wandering monk and a wandering knight, isn't that fate?" said Balthazar, pulling a deck of cards from his robe and starting to shuffle them. Then he continued, "Though you are dressed quite richly for such a person, which is very curious." "He can see," thought Richard, hearing the old man's words and seeing the sly smile on his face. "Besides, he's a natural rogue," he added to himself. Balthazar shuffled the deck and drew a card depicting a tall tower struck by lightning. The monk looked at it and frowned, saying, "Just as I thought. You are an unusual person. Since we are heading the same way, why not travel together?" He then put the deck back into the layers of his robe and looked at the boy, who had been standing with his mouth open in amazement. "Get on, boy. I'll give you a ride. But you, sir, forgive me. You are too big for my humble cart." Richard nodded and continued along the road, thinking that the people of the moon goddess's order had always been strange. After walking a bit, he turned and saw the boy already sitting on the seat, with the old man telling him something. Sighing tiredly, he walked on, recalling his first encounter with one of them. When Richard was 10 years old, he was walking towards the forge and somehow got lost, wandering between the dirty streets of his hometown. In an alley, he noticed a woman sleeping on the side of the road. Her clothes were dirty and gray, her hair unkempt and tangled, and around her neck hung the same moon symbol. As he passed by, she suddenly woke up and looked at him with surprised eyes, saying, "I smell a strong fate." Then she grabbed his hand. Richard tried to pull away, frightened, but she promised to do nothing, only asked to tell his fortune. He had no choice. She wouldn't let him go, and he had to agree. She let go of his hand and pulled out a deck of cards. After shuffling them well, she laid them out and drew 3. Richard no longer remembered what the cards were, but he remembered her words. Incredible. The fate of this world depends on you. You will save it or destroy it. Richard was initially shocked, but then laughed. He, an ordinary blacksmith's apprentice, would become a savior? It seemed ridiculous. Laughing, he left her, while she, on the contrary, was serious and looked at him with reverence. Since that incident, Richard didn't particularly trust people from this order, considering them charlatans. After a couple of miles, they saw the outlines of a village surrounded by a high palisade of sharp logs meant to protect the settlement from monster and animal attacks. As they approached, the road split, circling the village and leading inside through gates that were open. They were likely closed at night. People moved through them, going about their business with joyless and haggard faces. Drought and poverty left their marks on each of them. But when they saw the knight, they lifted their heads and whispered in surprise, "Who is this giant?" Richard paid them no attention and continued on his way. The old man on the cart followed, but soon stopped, and the boy jumped off, bowing and thanking both before running off. They entered the gates, and before them lay a small village with poor wooden houses covered with straw. Some houses had small gardens where nothing grew. Animal pens were visible in places. The main street intersected with smaller alleys. There were few people. Perhaps they were in the fields or occupied with other work. They walked down the main street, drawing surprised looks. Passing one of the houses, they saw a girl, thin and pitiful, dressed in what had once been a white dress, now black from soot and dirt. She hid behind a dry tree. Richard glanced at her, and when their eyes met, he saw fear and despair in them. Seeing she was noticed, she hid behind the houses. What happened to this poor girl? He thought. Continuing their way, they started looking for the local tavern and found it in the center of the village. It was a low but massive building made of dark wood, with a roof covered with tattered straw. The sign hanging above the door depicted a mug of frothy ale. Entering inside, Richard smelled the scent of wood smoke mixed with sour ale and old beer aromas. Inside it was dark and cool, the walls adorned with faded tapestries and shelves held old clay jugs. Long wooden tables and benches were scattered around the hall, most of which were empty. In the corner, a fireplace burned, its fire lazily crackling, lighting up the dark corners of the hall. Behind the counter stood the innkeeper, a stocky man with a bald head and a thick beard, his face etched with deep wrinkles that spoke of years of hard work. He looked at the knight and the monk who had entered his establishment with curiosity. A few patrons sat at tables wearily sipping their drinks. Their gazes turned toward the newcomers. Richard stepped forward, his armor clinking with each step. He approached the counter and nodded to the innkeeper. "Serve me your usual dish? And do you have a private room?" "You see, I have taken a knight's vow and cannot show my face," Richard said, looking at the innkeeper. The innkeeper was surprised but didn't ask any unnecessary questions. He called a young lad who led Richard to a small enclosed room off the main hall. The old monk tried to follow, but Richard blocked his way. "You see, I am blind and therefore won't see anything," the old man said indignantly. "We both know that's not true," Richard replied and shut the door in his face. Once in the small room, Richard waited. Soon, his food was brought, and he paid for it. When he was alone, he removed his helmet, which he had grown somewhat tired of, and began to eat. The meal was simple, stewed meat with potatoes and black bread, but after a long journey, it seemed like a feast. After finishing his meal, he put the helmet back on. Soon, there was a knock on the door. "Come in," he said, and the door opened. A young man, dressed a bit more lavishly than the other villagers, entered. His clothes, made of sturdy fabric, were adorned with embroidery and looked well kept. The young man's hair was dark and neatly trimmed, and his eyes shone with lively interest. He bowed and said, "Sir, the village elder sent me. As soon as he learned of your arrival, he asked me to escort you to him. Please, follow me." Richard understood and followed him. When he entered the hall, he saw the monk sitting at a table. Hearing the knight's steps, the old man immediately got up and followed. "He's quite persistent," Richard cursed to himself. They left the inn and headed toward the center of the village, where a large, beautiful house stood. It was the biggest and most well-kept building in the settlement. It was built of sturdy oak and had a roof covered with fresh straw. Flower boxes hung from the facade, and despite the drought, a few live plants grew in them. The windows were adorned with carved shutters, and a wooden bench stood in front of the entrance. The house was surrounded by a small but neat yard with a stone path leading to a massive oak door with wrought iron hinges. On the doorstep stood a plump old man with a round, ruddy face covered in gray stubble. His small, sharp eyes and large, slightly hooked nose gave him a keen look. He wore a richly embroidered caftan which, despite its age, looked tidy. His neatly arranged gray hair added to his imposing appearance, and his strong, muscular hands showed he was accustomed to physical labor. The old man smiled and bowed in greeting. "Welcome, Sir Knight," he said, straightening the folds on his richly embroidered caftan. "My name is Edmund. I am the elder of this village." Richard introduced himself in return, and the elder continued, "As you can see, we have been suffering from a drought for 3 years now. This calamity struck our village unexpectedly, but even worse, monsters have begun to proliferate. I don't know where they came from, but they attack our people. The biggest problem is that they have settled near our water source, which is just outside the village and is our main source of drinking water. We have another source, but it isn't enough for everyone, and we need to water the livestock as well. The river dried up a year ago, and we are on the brink of survival. Please, help us. When I heard that a knight had come to our village, I knew it was a sign from the heavens and that you are our savior." Richard frowned at his words. He didn't like being associated with the religion of light. It brought back unpleasant memories and opened wounds that hadn't healed yet. But he nodded. He needed the money. He would be grateful even for the crumbs the elder could offer. Richard had to think about sustenance, as he had a long journey ahead. Seeing that the knight agreed, the elder was delighted and called the same young man. "This is Graham. He will show you the way." As they were about to leave, the monk spoke up. "Please let me help. I can be of use." The elder looked at him uncertainly and nodded. Apparently, the Order of the Moon Goddess was unpopular even among common folk. Richard tried to object, but the monk was adamant. Then he gave up, realizing the monk wouldn't relent. They left the village and headed north. After half a mile, they turned onto a small path that led between the fields. The monk followed, this time on foot, having left his donkey and cart in the village. He held a staff, which he used to feel his way. Richard and his guide walked briskly, and the old man kept up, never stumbling, proving his ability to see. After crossing the fields, they found themselves in a small forest where ancient trees intertwined their branches, creating twilight even in broad daylight. Soon they came across a small stream, its waters sparkling in the rays of sunlight filtering through the leaves. Graham stopped and said he wouldn't go any further because it was dangerous. He pointed to the stream and added that if they followed it, they would reach the source. Richard thanked him and turned to Balthazar. "Old man, don't you want to stay behind? I can't guarantee your safety beyond this point." Balthazar smiled and replied, "Don't worry, I have a few survival tricks up my sleeve." Richard nodded, and turning, trudged along the stream. After about 500 paces, he saw a small dam made of stones, through which water trickled down the stream. Approaching closer, he looked around but saw no one. Then he turned his attention to the dam and noticed it was shallow, barely knee-deep. Water was bubbling up from the ground, releasing air bubbles. Richard decided to expand the search area and began to scour the bushes growing nearby. Suddenly he heard a disgruntled growl or croak, a muffled and indistinct sound. The bushes rustled, and a bunch of monsters spilled out of them. They resembled frogs, but had bodies like humans, covered in nasty, slimy skin. In their hands, they held sharp sticks. Surrounding Richard and the monk, the monsters started to dance and make croaking sounds as if in a battle trance, then simultaneously jumped. Richard turned his head worriedly towards the monk, but he pulled out a card that flew up, creating a yellow transparent shield around him. Seeing that the monk was safe, the knight swung his sword, cutting one of the monsters in half. The others, leaping, stuck their sticks into his armor but couldn't pierce it. They then began jumping on him, clinging to his body, trying to reach his flesh, and covering Richard with their disgusting slime. The knight dodged as best he could, cutting down one monster after another. Some he skewered through. The monk sat, watching the fight, his calm demeanor slightly irritating Richard. Seeing this, the monk threw another card, which attached itself to one of the creatures. The monster suddenly turned on its kin, evidently under a control spell. This slightly eased the flow of creatures attacking the knight, allowing him to kill almost all of them. Only 3 remained. Richard cut one down midair, sliced the legs off another, the sword gliding through like butter. The last one panicked and ran. Richard chased after it. He couldn't leave even one behind, knowing it could cost lives in the village. The creature darted through the bushes, breaking branches and hissing in pain. Richard was close behind, his heavy armor creaking, sword ready for the next strike. He pushed through dense thickets, crushing dry branches underfoot. Tall bushes blocked his view, but he never lost sight of the fleeing foe, his movements filled with determination. Suddenly, the monster veered to the side, plunging into tall, dry grass. Richard followed, trying not to fall behind. His breathing was heavy, but he didn't allow himself to stop. The grass whipped his face, leaving tiny scratches, but he paid no mind. Soon the thickets ended, and the monster dashed into the forest. The trees here stood close together, their canopies interwoven, casting a twilight even at midday. The forest was ancient and wild, with roots twisting across the ground like giant snakes. A sinister silence reigned here, broken only by the sounds of their footsteps and ragged breathing. Up ahead, the creature flitted between the trees, its sinister eyes glowing in the dim light like 2 green embers. The chase led them to a narrow ravine hidden in the shadows of the trees. The ravine's walls rose high, creating a narrow passage leading into the earth. The creature dove into the ravine without hesitation. Richard followed, his heavy steps echoing off the stone walls. The ravine led to a small cave hidden behind a moss-covered outcrop. The cave entrance was dark and foreboding, as if nature itself was warning of danger. The monster disappeared inside, and Richard, gritting his teeth, followed. Inside, the cave was spacious and cold, its walls damp and covered in moss. Long stalactites hung from the ceiling, dripping water that echoed through the cave. The floor was uneven, with sharp stones scattered about. In the depths of the cave, light penetrated weakly, with only occasional sunbeams filtering through cracks in the rock, illuminating the path. The silence of the cave was broken only by their footsteps and heavy breathing. Up ahead, in the dim light, the creature moved quickly, its eyes glowing ominously. Richard continued the pursuit, his steps growing faster and more confident. The deeper they went, the colder it became. The air was thick with dampness and the scent of earth. The path grew more winding, and Richard carefully watched each step to avoid slipping on the wet stones. Finally, the cave opened into a large underground chamber. A hole in the ceiling let in light, creating a dimly lit space. It was a dead end. The creature had nowhere to run and lunged at Richard. He simply raised his hand and with a swing of his sword beheaded it. The head thudded to the ground and the body collapsed with a wet slap. Sheathing his sword, Richard looked around. He had stumbled upon an intriguing place. It seemed someone had lived here. In the corner stood a wooden table with parchments and books. Shelves held bottles and jars filled with mysterious liquids, and in the center of the chamber stood an obelisk bearing the image of a rhombus with a pupil. That symbol again, he thought. Candles lay around the obelisk in a circle, and a pentagram drawn in blood was on the floor. Richard frowned. Offerings of bones lay before the obelisk. Upon closer inspection, he saw both animal and human skulls. He cursed, realizing that dark rituals had been conducted here. But for what purpose? Could this be linked to the drought? Was someone causing it or trying to end it? A whirlwind of questions spun in his mind. He looked around again, inspecting the ground, and was horrified to find numerous human bones and skulls scattered about. This place was horrific. Deciding to inspect the table and books, he found only old lore and potion recipes. Who lived here? He wondered. Suddenly, he heard a rustle and felt movement out of the corner of his eye. He turned sharply, crossing his arms in a shield-like gesture, and was struck by a powerful blow that sent him flying to the other side of the cave, crashing into the wall. Falling to the ground, he struggled to open his eyes. The blow had been truly strong. Where he had been, a monstrous creature now stood. It was tall, nearly twice the height of the knight, with burning eyes and an elongated face. Its hair, like a giant hat, stretched into a cone, exceeding the head's size threefold. It wore a red dress that seemed part of the creature. On its belt was an emblem of a skull, and from its neck, like tree branches, sprouted numerous arms. These arms bent and flexed, fingers seeming to grasp at something. They protruded from the neck around the body, forming a horrifying skirt of arms. In its hands, the creature held a basket filled with children's heads, screaming in agony. Suddenly, the creature let out a terrifying scream and lunged at Richard. He jumped up and, drawing his sword, deflected the incoming blow. The creature swung the basket like a club, and with each strike the infant's wails created a mental assault. Richard felt the screams penetrate his mind, causing his heart to clench with pain and fear. He dodged as best he could, his sword flashing in the dim light, striking the enemy. But every move was an effort. The creature was incredibly fast and strong, its blows landing true, and Richard began to feel fatigue. With each moment, his movement slowed, and the creature seemed to sense it, its attacks growing fiercer. Suddenly, one of the basket's blows knocked Richard off his feet, and his helmet flew off. He fell to the ground, revealing the head of a wolf. The creature froze, its burning eyes widening, and it slowed its movements. It seemed to recognize something, its fingers still, and the basket lowered. Richard, breathing heavily, lifted his head. The creature, seeing his face, took a step back. In its eyes flickered something akin to pity. It let out a quiet, almost plaintive sound, and as if making a decision, slowly retreated into the darkness, disappearing into the depths of the cave. The knight, left alone, stared long in the direction where the creature had vanished. He couldn't understand what had just happened, but was grateful for the unexpected reprieve. He slowly got up, his body aching, feeling several broken bones. Taking a few steps, he picked up his helmet, put it on, and with a tired sigh, limped towards the exit. Walking through the cave, he felt strange sensations. The werewolf's regeneration was kicking in. The pain gradually subsided, bones knitting back together. By the time he emerged from the cave, he was almost healed. He was shocked by the properties of his new form. Previously, one blow would have killed him, but now things were different. The joy of new strength mingled with sadness. No matter how good these abilities were, he still wanted to be human. Silence reigned in the ravine, and Richard headed back, following his own tracks. Reaching the forest, he had walked half a mile when he suddenly heard a scream. What now? He thought to himself, and headed in that direction. Reaching the spot, he parted the branches and saw a clearing where a girl in a dress was crawling, with a monster slowly stalking her. It was one of those frog-like creatures. Apparently, he hadn't killed them all. Richard dashed forward and, reaching the monster, cut it in half mid-leap. Green blood splattered on the grass and the girl. She trembled with fear, looking from him to the slain monster. The knight extended his hand, offering help. The girl, overcoming herself, stood up, her knees shaking, and bowed, thanking her savior. Richard was embarrassed, saying it was nothing. But tears streamed from her eyes, and she collapsed to her knees, sobbing. He did nothing, allowing her to cry it out. Looking at her, he remembered the girl hiding behind the tree in the village. He felt sorry for her. He waited for about 10 minutes, standing at the edge of the clearing while the girl calmed down. Once she was composed, she stood up and thanked him again. He said he would escort her back to the village, and she agreed. "What is your name?" he asked her. "Carol," she replied, struggling to get the words out as if afraid to say too much. Richard introduced himself, and she nodded and started walking. They remained silent for the rest of the way. Finally, they arrived at the dam. There was no one there, not even the old man. They followed the path to the road and returned to the village. Carol stopped, saying she couldn't go any further. "Why?" Richard asked, but she only bowed again and disappeared among the houses. Soon Richard arrived at the elder's house and told him what had happened, including the cave and the huge creature. The elder listened with horror in his eyes, but thanked him and paid part of the reward. Richard needed to patrol the area for a few more days to ensure all the creatures were destroyed. The elder offered him a place to stay, but Richard declined, saying he would sleep at the inn. As Richard walked down the street, someone suddenly ran up to him grabbed his hand and pulled him aside. It was Carol. Her eyes were filled with fear, and she looked around nervously. Pulling him along, she whispered urgently, "Please, follow me." Richard, deciding to find out what she wanted, followed her. They slipped behind the houses into a small alley where Carol finally let go of his hand and bowed. "Forgive my rudeness, but the locals don't like me, so I couldn't act differently," she said, her voice trembling with nervousness. "Locals don't like you? I wonder why," thought Richard. "I heard you needed a place to stay, and since you saved me, please allow me to repay you by offering shelter," Carol continued, her eyes shining with sincerity. Richard felt sorry for her. Reluctantly, he agreed, recalling Liana's betrayal and remaining cautious. They walked through the village streets, with Carol constantly looking around as if afraid of being seen. The village was dark and quiet, with only a few lanterns lighting the way. Finally, they reached the farthest edge of the village and stopped in front of a small, old, but well-kept house. It was built of dark wood, the roof covered with moss and straw, but everything looked neat and clean. The walls showed signs of dirt that someone had recently washed away. Carol opened the door and invited Richard inside. The interior was modest but cozy. In the center of the room stood a table covered with an old cloth. Shelves along the walls held cracked pots and jugs, and on one of them was an ancient lamp, casting a soft, warm light. In the corner was a hearth with a fire burning, filling the house with warmth and light. "Come in, sit down," Carol said, gesturing to the table. She offered him dinner, but he sighed tiredly and said he wasn't hungry, explaining the rules of his nightly vow. She nodded understandingly, poured herself some tea, and sat by the fire. Richard struggled with a question that had been bothering him and finally decided to ask. "Forgive me for asking, but why do the villagers treat you so poorly?" Carol looked deeply at the knight, her hand holding the cup of tea trembling, as did her voice. "The thing is, they believe I am a witch," she began. "From the moment I was born, all the curses of this world fell upon me. Not a single day went by when I was happy. Even my own family turned away from me. I survived thanks to the tiny mercy of a few people. That's how I grew up on the outskirts of life in this village." Richard listened to her, and his heart filled with pity for this poor girl. "I was born the 7th daughter," she continued. "In our village, it's believed that if a 7th daughter is born, she will undoubtedly be a witch. From the moment I was born, I was cursed. For a while, I didn't even know what affection and love were until I saw how other children were loved. I was always chased away and made to do only the dirtiest work. Every misfortune was blamed on me. Sometimes I was beaten so severely that I nearly died. You are the first person to treat me with pity and respect. When you extended your hand to me, it was the happiest moment of my life. I am truly grateful to you." When she finished speaking, Richard looked at her with pity. Poor girl, he thought. She bore all the vices of this world. She sat before him, her eyes full of tears, her hands trembling, a symbol of all the injustices and cruelties that people could inflict on each other. Watching Carol, Richard asked, "Have you ever thought of leaving the village?" Carol sighed and replied, looking into the fire, "Yes, I have had that desire, but something always held me back. Sometimes my cowardice, sometimes a strange bond with this village. So I still stayed here. Sometimes passing travelers spoke of the outside world, and I eavesdropped on their conversations, dreaming of one day leaving. Maybe one day I'll gather the courage, take my belongings, and set out on a long journey. Who knows when that will happen?" Her eyes clouded with sadness, and she took another sip of tea. After that, they fell silent. The room was filled with silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Soon, Carol stood and pointed to a room at the back of the house where a simple straw bed stood. "This is your room for the night," she said softly. Richard thanked her and closed the door behind him. He lay down on the bed, feeling his body sink into the softness of the straw. Thousands of thoughts swirled in his head about the day's events, the battles, encounters, and uncovered secrets. He thought about Carol, her suffering and hopes, her bravery despite all the trials she had faced. Closing his eyes, he drifted into sleep, where the past and future intertwined, creating strange visions. He dreamt of Lyanna in the arms of Sir Goodwin, with Gareth and Master Erwin standing beside them. They all looked down at him, laughing loudly and pointing fingers. He looked around and realized he was floating in a huge, boiling cauldron of soup, while Gareth stirred it with a giant ladle. The water boiled and he began to flail in it. Suddenly he heard the ringing of a bell. Not understanding where it came from, Richard woke up realizing he was lying in bed. Outside, desperate screams and other noises could be heard. He jumped up, put on his helmet, drew his sword, and left the room. The house was empty. Carol had gone somewhere. He headed outside and realized something was happening. Making his way to the main streets, he saw people running towards the village center, their faces filled with terror. He noticed the young man named Graham running by. Stopping him, Richard asked what was happening. Trying to catch his breath, Graham began to speak, his eyes filled with fear and despair. "It happened just after dark. We closed the gates and headed home. All the villagers were preparing for bed when we suddenly heard a strange knocking. It echoed through the village and seemed to pound inside our heads. People started coming outside, searching for the source of the sound, which led everyone to the gates. We opened the window in the gate to see what it might be, but nothing happened. Then suddenly, a terrible creature emerged from the darkness. It scared everyone so much that they all backed away immediately, and then we heard a scream. It was the watchman on the tower, screaming his lungs out. I climbed the tower and saw hundreds, if not more, of these creatures completely surrounding the village. When the villagers found out, panic ensued and everyone ran to the village center. Apparently these creatures can't get through the fence, but either way we're doomed and might die." Having said this, Graham broke free and ran off. Richard frowned, gripping his sword, and headed toward the gates. Upon reaching them, he found no one there. Peering through the window, Richard looked around but saw nothing. Soon he heard the knocking again, as if someone was beating on a skull from the inside. The knocking continued, and suddenly a creature emerged from the darkness. It floated in the air like a ghost, but was solid, as the grass beneath it flattened and withered, turning black. The creature was an elongated sphere covered in thick hair trailing along the ground. Instead of a face, it had a deer skull glowing with red fire. Its hands were human but shriveled, unnaturally jutting out from its sides and constantly moving. This creature evoked a sense of unnaturalness and primal fear. When the creature abruptly moved toward Richard, he jumped back in fear. But as the creature approached the window, it couldn't push its hand through, as if hitting an invisible barrier. Apparently, the village had some sort of shield protecting it. Soon, hundreds of similar creatures started emerging from the darkness, as if sensing prey. Richard stepped back, trying to think of what to do next, but nothing came to mind. He decided to go to the elder. His thoughts swirled with questions and plans, but no clear solution. When Richard nearly reached the village center, he saw a crowd of people, their faces hardened and filled with bloodlust. They had gathered around something, and Richard had to push through them to get closer. At first, they looked around nervously, but seeing who it was, they immediately stepped aside. Finally, he saw what had gathered all these people, and his blood ran cold. In the center of the crowd, amidst angry shouts, he saw Carol tied to a stake. Under her they were piling logs and kindling, preparing for a fire. She was unconscious. The people shouted, "Witch! Burn the witch! She's to blame for everything!" As he looked into their faces, he saw inhuman rage. It was as if a pack of wild animals had gathered, demanding a sacrifice. Fury gripped Richard, and he was about to charge into the crowd, swinging his sword, but someone grabbed his arm. It was Balthazar, the blind monk. He shook his head side to side and spoke quietly. "Things are not as they seem." He showed Richard a card depicting a monster, half human. Richard was enraged. This card could describe him too. He snapped, "Are you crazy, old man?" and broke free of his grip, leaping into the center of the crowd. The villagers had already started the fire, and its flames were licking at the poor girl like a monster. Richard jumped to the stake, sparks flying, and cut the ropes with his sword. He scooped Carol into his arms and leapt out of the flames. The crowd groaned in displeasure, and several men with pitchforks stepped forward to confront him. But Richard swung his sword in a wide arc, and their bravery evaporated, and the crowd parted, continuing to murmur and shout curses. Richard paid them no heed. He headed for the village exit, knowing Carol was not safe here. Better to die at the hands of monsters than on a pyre. Maybe he could somehow deal with these creatures. When Richard reached the gates, he opened them slightly and stepped outside, clutching his sword in one hand and holding Carol in the other. Bracing for battle, he listened to the night. Soon the familiar knocking sounded from the darkness, and one of the creatures emerged into the light. Richard was ready to fight, but nothing happened. He moved forward, and soon hundreds of these creatures surrounded him but did nothing. Even the knocking in his head subsided. Something is wrong here, he thought. Suddenly, Carol woke up and looked around, seemingly understanding everything. Reaching out to Richard's helmet, she gently caressed it and said, "Thank you for saving me, and forgive me." Smoke wafted from her hands and seeped into his helmet. Breathing it in, Richard felt his vision blur, and he began to lose consciousness. Soon, he collapsed to the ground and blacked out. He woke up a few minutes later, thanks to his natural resilience, his werewolf resistance. Sitting up and looking around, he saw no creatures, but screams of horror echoed from the village. Jumping up, he grabbed his sword and headed there. Chaos and panic reigned in the village. Blood was everywhere. Hundreds of monsters were slaughtering people, and the sight made Richard's heart sink. He ran to the nearest monsters and started cutting them down. They fought back, but they weren't invincible. Destroying one after another, Richard saw the creature he had met in the cave. It was devouring people, and he realized all these monsters were connected to it. He had to destroy it. He ran towards it and saw the old monk defending many people with his transparent shield barrier. But there were those who had fallen victim to the monsters. Richard continued running and, swinging, struck the main monster with his sword. The creature did not expect the attack and took damage. Several arms around its neck fell off and dropped to the ground. The monster roared and moved towards the knight. The battle was fierce. The monster attacked with its basket, trying to knock him down. Its hands slid over his armor, leaving deep scratches. Richard tried to dodge, but the monster was faster. One of the blows knocked the sword from his hands, and Richard fell to the ground, struggling to get up. The monster raised its arm, preparing to deliver a fatal blow, but at that moment something awoke in Richard. An inner rage and the strength of a berserker overwhelmed him. He roared like a wild beast and grabbed his sword with renewed strength. His strikes became more powerful and precise. Richard began to cut off the monster's arms one by one. With each severed arm, the monster roared in pain and fury. At some point, Richard's helmet flew off, revealing his wolf-like face, but he kept fighting, ignoring it. His animalistic features became more pronounced. The monster, seeing his transformation, tried to retreat, but the knight gave it no chance. He delivered the final blow, driving his sword straight into the creature's neck. The monster's head flew off. The body collapsed to the ground, and dark blood gushed out, soaking the earth around it. The creatures began to emit horrifying screams, then crumbled into pieces, leaving behind only dolls made of twigs and threads. People slowly regained their senses and began helping each other, but Richard paid them no mind. He only looked at the place where the main monster had died. There lay a headless body in a familiar dress. Nearby was Carol's head. Richard stood in a daze, his gaze empty. Slowly, thoughts began to swirl in his head. Why did she do this? How did this happen? Were these people to blame? His eyes stung with tears that ran down the fur on his face. This world was too cruel and unjust. People created monsters that killed them. Would they ever change? Richard pondered the lies, betrayal, envy, and anger that plagued humanity. Would they chase them until the end of existence? Or would people eventually understand that there was nothing wrong with their differences and stop killing each other? The crowd's shouts distracted him from his thoughts. He looked around, trying to understand what was happening. People gathered around, raising pitchforks and fists, shouting angrily. Richard finally made out their cries. "Get out, monster! You brought this upon us!" In their faces he saw fear. He realized he was standing without his helmet, and the people didn't care that he was their savior. They only saw a monster. The knight slowly picked up his helmet and put it on. Then, sheathing his sword, he took off his cloak and wrapped Carol's body in it. Suddenly, he saw the boy he had saved in the forest, his face devoid of hatred, clinging tightly to the coat of the man standing next to him. Richard sighed wearily and headed towards the village exit, passing the hostile crowd. After a few miles, he found a suitable spot and began to dig a grave. First with his hands, then helping with his sword, as the drought had made the ground hard. He continued digging until the grave was deep enough. Carefully placing the girl's body in it, folding her hands on her chest, he gave her one last look and began to cover her. Disguising the grave, fearing the locals would desecrate it, the knight stepped onto the road and started walking. He walked, reflecting on what had happened. Soon, he heard the sound of hooves. Stopping, Richard saw a familiar cart pulled by a donkey. The old man in a straw hat was sitting in it. Stopping next to Richard, the old man said, "It seems we are headed the same way. So, I'll keep you company." Richard said nothing, turning and trudging alone down the road.